So here's we finish up Unit 2. We have what's known as market power and structures. And so we spent a little bit of time last class discussing a few of these concepts, specifically when we were talking about the market structure that is defined as a monopoly. So we brought up the idea of monopolies, where a single company kind of runs or controls everything. We talked a little bit about that, but we want to jump into that more today as we go. Within that, we're also going to talk about, within these market structures, we want to talk about their production, something known as the production function. And we're going to talk about some ideas such as total cost, total revenue, total profit, maybe some of those ideas that you've heard of before. We'll kind of connect them all together. And then finally, if you're a company and you want to, what's your goal? You want to make as much money as possible, make as much profit. Well, how do you do that? Where's that point that you should be producing at in order to do that? And we'll discuss what that is and why it is where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. So first of all, starting off talking about what's known as the production function. So when you see this idea of a function, again, I just want to connect this back to something you might have seen within something like math, because you guys have all seen functions within math. You might have seen something that looks something like this. Y is equal to f of x. But again, what is that really saying? Well, what it's saying is we have some input x, and we toss that input x into a function, where maybe we will square it, we'll add some stuff to it, subtract some things from it, whatever it might be. But we put in an x, put it into this function, and then it spits out some output. Now, when we spit out that output, what we can then say about this entire kind of equation here is that we have y, our output, is equal to some function of x. That's great. But how does this connect to what we're talking about today? Well, we're talking about this in relation to, again, what we call the production function. So how is production that companies do similar to a function like we might see? Well, the way we can think about this is that, yes, production is like a function. So again, you will never see this formula like on a test or anything, but I just want to illustrate this idea. Say we have something that looks like this. Q is equal to f of L and K. And you're like, well, what in the world does that mean? Well, L and K are just kind of abbreviations we use for some of those inputs of production. We use labor, which is the L. We use capital, which is the K. We use the letter C for cost, so we have to use a different letter for capital. But we put labor and capital, those other resources, into some function. We put them into some combination, mix them all together, and out comes some output, right? So we put in labor, we put in capital, we put those into some combination together, we do some things with them, and out comes some output of quantity, right? And so just really simply, we can think about our production. If you're a company, you can really think of it as say, hey, our output or the quantity of products we make is equal to some function, some combination of the labor we use, the capital we use, those resources we use. That's how we make stuff. We combine resources to get some output. Now, one thing we also want to be aware of and we need to be aware of is that when we talk about production or making stuff, businesses really think in two different time frames. Those time frames are referred to as the short run and the long run. Now, simply put, you can probably look at this and say, yeah, I can bet the short run, that's the short one, the long run is long. And you'd be right, but we kind of have to define what we mean by short and long. Because here's what I want you to know. It is absolutely not that the short run and the long run, it is not that they are a specific length of time, okay? And so when we see this, we actually see that the short run is not like, oh, it's less than 2 years, or the long run is more than 3. It's not like that at all. What we end up seeing is that the short run is a time frame in which the quantity of at least one of our factors of production, one of our resources, is fixed. And so what we're saying here is, like, if you think about it, fixed just means that, again, we can't change it really like quickly at all. So if I have a company and I have a factory, if I want to start producing more, like starting tomorrow, can I just like build a brand new factory overnight or build another factory overnight? Well, the answer is no. Like it's not that easy. Like I can't just overnight just open a brand new factory, like build a new factory. So right now my size of my factory is fixed. Now, if I want to hire more labor overnight, like if I want to hire more workers and have more people come in to work the next day, like, yeah, that's variable. I can change that. That one's easy to change from day to day. But the short run is a time frame where at least one factor of production, more specifically like our capital, like our machinery factories and stuff, that is fixed. Now, the long run, though, is a time period in which all of our factors of production are varied. Because think about it, like over a longer period of time, like, yeah, I can build another factory, or I can install all new machinery, or I can like restructure my business. And so we think about this in these two different time frames. Now, the long run, if we look back at like that production function, if you think of it this way, what we would say is that all inputs, so capital and labor in this case, are variable. So both that L and K can change. And again, we're never going to do this mathematically, but as you can see, if you had two different variables you're plugging into some function, like it's going to get kind of messy, right? And there's a lot going on within the long run production function. We're not going to deal a lot with the long run. We're going to more specifically think about things in terms of the short run. And like we said, the short run is whenever just one of these factors of production, right, either labor or capital, is fixed. And so let's suppose that our labor is variable, right? Like I can hire another worker, or I can tell more workers to come into work the next day or the day after, but my capital is fixed. Like I only have so much of that capital. Now, again, mathematically, we're never going to do anything with this, but I want you to think about that like in terms of a function that you might see in math class where it's like, you change one of those inputs and it's going to change our output. You change that X that you put into some function and it's going to change our Y. And the same thing is true with our production. As we add more workers, it's going to allow us to produce more, or maybe to a certain point, it's going to allow us to produce less, or whatever it might be. Now, when it comes to production, there are some terms that we need to know and be aware of. And again, some of these you've probably heard of, a lot of these you've probably heard of, but I want to make sure that we really understand what they mean. So I think one of the biggest confusions that I see with people is confusing the idea between like revenue and profit. So there's going to be two that show up here that we need to make sure that we understand and know the difference between. Revenue is the total amount of sales made by a firm. So maybe a way you can think about this is just like how much money ends up in the cash register at the end of the night, right? Because the way we can find this is we just take the price times the quantity. Like if I own a pizza place, and if I sell 20 pizzas for $10 a piece, right? Well, my quantity is 20 pizzas. The price is 10. So if I want to know how much money I made from pizzas this day, I would be like, okay, 20 pizzas at $10 a piece, 20 times 10 is 200. And that's how I would find out my total revenue, the total amount of money that went into my cash register. Now, one kind of other thing that does pop up with this sometimes is the idea of marginal revenue. Now, again, you're not going to have to solve for this. I just want you to understand kind of the intuition behind it. But marginal revenue, remember, marginal always just means change. So marginal revenue is the increase in our total revenue from selling one more product. So think about it. Every time I sell one more pizza, my total revenue changes by some amount. And so if I sell one more pizza, the change in my total revenue is going to be 10 because I'm selling it for $10. The change in quantity, well, if it's one more pizza, it's 1. So 10 over 1 tells me that my marginal revenue for selling one more pizza is $10. And that's just equal to the selling price. So our marginal revenue is just our selling price because it's the change in our total revenue. It's saying, hey, how much more money goes into your cash register for selling one more pizza? Now, that's all great. That's the money we're making. But if you remember, in order to make money, you got to spend money. And so we got to also think about our costs. And so one that you're going to see is this idea known as total cost. So total cost is the total amount of money that we have to spend in order to produce some number of goods, right? So if you want to make goods and services, like you have to spend money on your resources, you have to pay your workers, you have to pay for your factory, all those types of things. And we actually categorize our total costs into two different segments because some of those costs are what we call fixed costs. And so again, that word fixed we see fairly often. Fixed just means it doesn't change. And so suppose again that I'm making pizza and maybe I rent out a space in order to have my pizza shop. Well, there's a cost that stays the same regardless of the quantity of pizzas I'm producing, right? So like my landlord, the person that I'm paying to rent out my pizza shop, like they don't care if I'm making one pizza that day or if I'm making 100 pizzas that day. They're like, you know what? You need to pay your, $10,000 in rent every single week, every single month, no matter what. They don't care how many I'm making. That cost stays the same no matter how many pizzas I make. I have to pay it. Now, other costs are what we call variable costs. And variable costs are costs that do change as we produce more. I think that makes a lot of sense. We think about a lot of our production costs in that way. Like if I want to make more of a product, like, well, I have to hire more workers. And if I'm hiring more workers, I got to pay more workers, right? And so every time I want to make more, like I'm going to have to hire more workers along the way. Now, those costs are great, and we're going to be comparing, total revenue and total costs together in order to get our profit, right? We'll talk more about that on the next slide. But one other thing with cost we need to be aware of is this idea of marginal cost. Marginal cost is the increase in our total cost for making one more of a product. Or the way you can see our formula it's written, it's our change in our total cost divided by our change in our quantity. And really what this is saying, it's not saying our average cost. What this is saying is that, okay, anytime I spend more money, maybe hire another worker, every time I hire another worker, I'm going to spend a certain amount of money. Well, how much more product do I get out of that worker? And how much is that going to cost me? So for example, let's say I pay my workers each, say $100 a day. And let's suppose that, I hire another worker. I pay that worker $100 to come into work that day. And when I pay them $100 to come into work, let's say they help us produce an additional, let's say 20 pizzas, right? So that means the change in my total cost is $100 because I'm paying another worker, one more worker, another $100. And the change in my quantity is we get, 20 more pizzas out of that, right? Well, then what is the marginal cost, or what is the change in my total cost over my change in quantity? Well, it's $100 more to get 20 more pizzas. That means the marginal cost is $5, right? And so we actually, again, thinking back to like 1.2 when we were comparing marginal benefit and marginal cost, that's kind of what we're going to be doing here, because marginal revenue is your change in your total revenue, and that's your benefit you get. The marginal cost is what you had to spend to get it. And so again, we can think about this all relating back to those same ideas we talked back about in 1.2. But then finally, we have something really important, and that's the idea of profit. And remember, we do need to make sure we can differentiate between total revenue and profit. So profit is the total amount of money that is left over from your sales after factoring in those production costs, right? So we had our revenue. That was the total amount of money that went into our cash register, but we don't necessarily get to keep all that. So our profit is equal to our total revenue minus our total cost, right? Total revenue minus our total cost. Now, we want to maximize profit. Like if you're a business, like your goal is to make as much money as possible. Like that's what you want to do. Well, how do you do that? And then we saw this with our learning objectives, is that we maximize our profit where our marginal cost is equal to our marginal revenue. But why exactly is it at that point? Well, first of all, hopefully you can see the connection here between back when we talked about this in 1.2, right, where we said we maximized our benefit wherever marginal cost was equal to marginal benefit. Well, this is the exact same idea, right? Except we're just kind of stretching out the idea to businesses. Businesses will maximize their profit, which is their benefit, where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. And marginal revenue, again, is their marginal benefit. But why exactly is that? So let's think a little bit more intuitively. Marginal cost, again, is the additional cost for one more of a product. We said marginal revenue is the change in our total revenue. So again, we can think about marginal cost like in that last part we say right there, where it gradually increases. We said marginal cost increases. We've talked about that before. And marginal revenue is our selling price. So pretty much that always stays the same. Now, let's think about those instances where our marginal cost would be less than our marginal revenue. Right? So what that means is the additional cost, say, to make one more pizza is less than what we get to sell that pizza for. Well, hey, if it costs you less to make a pizza than what you're selling it for, keep making pizzas, right? Because you're adding more and more to your profit. So if, say that a pizza, the additional cost for this pizza cost me $5, but I get to sell it for $10, well, that's awesome. Like I'm making an additional $5 off that pizza. That's $5 in profit that I get to make there. And so I'm going to want to keep going. I'm going to want to keep making that. Now, we'll eventually get to a point where our marginal cost is equal to our marginal revenue. And remember, we said once these things get equal, if it costs us the same to make it as we're selling it for, we're breaking even. So we've squeezed out all those little bits of profit from each additional pizza that we're making up to this point wherever they're equal. But remember, we said we don't want to go past the point where our marginal revenue is equal to our marginal cost. Because once we see that our marginal cost is greater than our marginal revenue, think about what's going on there. We're saying that it cost us more to make one more pizza than we get to sell it for. So maybe we, as our marginal cost increases, maybe the next or additional pizza I make costs me $12 to make it, but I only sell it for $10. Would I ever do that? Would I ever make a pizza for $12 and then sell it for $10? Like, no, like I'm going to lose $2 there. I'm losing profit. And so again, we don't want to go beyond that point of marginal cost equaling marginal revenue, because beyond that point, once marginal cost is greater than marginal revenue, we start to lose money. Now, this concept of marginal benefit equaling marginal cost, we talked about it back in 1.2. We're talking about it here with maximizing profit and marginal revenue equaling marginal cost. And we say this is actually true for pretty much every single business type, every single market. Now, we got to talk a little bit more about these markets and how exactly do we define these markets. So we said a market is just anywhere where buyers and sellers interact, but there's different types of markets out there that exist. Different sizes, different scales, different all sorts of things. Now, how do we define these? Well, typically we define a market. We look at the number of suppliers or the number of businesses, the number of firms that are within that market. So we already talked about this one. We said with like Monopoly, you guys know that. You say there's only one business there. But what about when there's more than one? How do we categorize those? Well, we break these down into what we call their market structures. So obviously the number of suppliers is one of those characteristics, but we look at a lot of other characteristics of these markets, such as how they organize, how they compete with one another, and how they price against one another, those types of things. But really when it comes down to it, we group these into 4 different categories. And so what I want to wrap up with here is just what are those 4 different categories, and what are some of the characteristics of each of those? So if we were to kind of like draw this out, and I don't think this is necessarily in your notes. If you want to draw it in your extra space, you can. This is kind of a scale, the way like I like to think about it. If we categorize market structures by the number of firms, obviously there's we got some different options. You could have lots of firms all the way down to just one firm. Now let's start up all the way at our lots. We'll start at lots of firms. Now, in order to understand the lots of firms one, we're actually going to deal with something that's kind of like hypothetical. Like we don't see any like perfectly true types of these markets, but we can get pretty close. And we call it perfect competition. So again, the word perfect should be a hint that, hey, if it's perfect, like we're not going to get all the way there because it's perfect and no market is truly perfect. But let's kind of understand what exactly that means. So for perfect competition, kind of the way we can just describe it is it's many firms, so lots of different companies selling identical products. So that's kind of the weird part here is the products are exactly identical. There's no difference between one company or another's product. So each firm is producing a good that has absolutely no unique characteristics. What would be an example of this? Well, like the closest example that we can maybe get to is like some agricultural stuff, like so maybe like feed corn, and maybe there is a difference that I don't know about, but feed corn, like the corn that you're feeding cows, like there's lots and lots and lots of farmers out there, but their corn probably has no unique characteristics from the person in the field next to theirs or on the other side of theirs or whatever it might be. And so therefore, since everyone is selling the exact same product with no unique characteristics, we see that businesses that are known as what's called price takers. So in order to understand what a price taker is, it might help to know what a price maker is, right? If you're a price maker, you get to make the price. You get to determine the price. A price taker means that you just have to go along with whatever the market price is because each firm has such a significant portion of the market. So maybe if we think about like this agricultural market as like a pie chart. So if you see this pie chart here, everybody's got like a really baby-sized slice of the pie. Now let's say that our farm represents one of those little slices of the pie. If our business represents one of those slices of the pie, how much influence do we have over all the rest of the slices? Like next to none. Like if we got Bradley's farm over here and I decide to raise the price of my corn from $7 a bushel to $7.50 a bushel, I'm trying to make more money. Are all those other slices of pie going to look at that and say, oh my gosh, Bradley's farm is raising their prices, whatever, we need to do that too to make more? And it's like, no, they look at me and they're like, okay, Bradley's kind of dumb for raising his prices. We're just going to stay where we're at. We're all going to get to sell, and he's not going to sell any of his corn, right? Or the same thing is true the other way. Like, let's say that my little, baby slice of the pie, I decide to lower my price from $7 to $6. Would everyone freak out and say, oh my gosh, we have to compete with Bradley? And it's like, no, because I represent such a small percentage of the market. I would sell up my corn like instantly, and then everyone else still gets to sell theirs at a higher price. And all that happens is I lost out on some money. And so I just have to go along with that, whatever the market price is. And that's true for all of these companies represented by all these little slices of the pie. Now, what is true for all these companies is that they all do maximize their profit where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. That's going to be a characteristic that is not only true of this market, but of every single market type we see. We also see one of the characteristics is because everybody has such a small slice of the pie, there are no restrictions on entry or exit from the market. Well, what exactly do we mean by that? Well, if you want to get in and have a little bit of a slice of the pie too, there's nothing really stopping you. Like, yeah, you have to have some land or whatever, but if you want to get in there and compete in the market, it's actually fairly easy. There's really no restrictions on getting into the market as well. Now, a few other things we want to make note of. Firms will enter the market if other firms are making profit, right? So, for example, let's say that there's farmers who are growing soy or whatever, and they look around and they see, hey, there's a bunch of these corn farmers that are making profit. Like, what are we doing growing soy? We should be over there growing corn too. That's where they're making money. We would see that new firms or new businesses would enter the market. Some of those farmers would stop growing soy. They would start growing corn instead because, hey, that's where there's money. So new firms would enter the market if firms are making profit. Now, if they see that there's firms losing money, so maybe there's some of these corn farmers looking around and like, hey, there's so many farmers out here, we're actually losing money. We can't cover our costs. Businesses will start to exit the market. They'll be like, hey, you know what? Instead of growing corn, I'm going to go start growing soy instead because at least I won't lose money there. So if firms or businesses as a whole are losing money, you'll see firms exit the market. And then that whole entry exit thing will kind of stop when firms make no profit. Now, this is sometimes a weird concept for people to understand. They're like, well, if you're not making profit, what are you doing there? Well, remember, we're still covering our costs. We're still taking home our paycheck. We're still making a living. We're just not making additional money on top of that, right? And so we said an example of this could be agriculture. Another example would be the foreign exchange market. So we'll talk more about that later. But those little kiosks where maybe you arrive in a new country and you can exchange your currency for another country's currency. Well, you're really buying the other country's currency. And so if I go to England and I want to buy some British pounds, well, all British pounds are identical. It doesn't matter if I get it from kiosk A or kiosk B or kiosk C. It's all the exact same product. It's all the exact same pound. And so they have to just go along with whatever the market price or the exchange rate is for those, And so, again, these are more hypothetical markets. We don't see an exact example of this. But as we get into imperfect competition, we're going to see a lot more examples in terms of what we experience. So thinking about imperfect competition, this first one that comes up is this idea of monopolistic competition. Monopolistic competition. No, this is something that people always miss. You see the word monopolistic, and you all automatically think monopoly. That is not the case. Don't think that way. You'll miss points if you think that way, okay? The reason that that's there is because the defining characteristic of it is that that products are a little more unique, and that uniqueness is what makes it monopolistic. So don't think of monopolistic competition as there being a monopoly. This will mess you up on the test, I just promise, so pay careful attention. So monopolistic competition is similar to perfect competition in the sense that there's many firms, but the difference here is that they're selling differentiated products, right? So they sell similar goods, but they differentiate themselves. I think a good example of this is the clothing industry, right? Most things you think of are monopolistically competitive. I like to think of the clothing market because it's how many clothing producers are there out there? Well, there's literally hundreds. There's thousands probably, And all of those companies are selling clothes, those are similar goods, but they also differentiate themselves, right? And it's this product differentiation, this, and you can see the root different. They make their products stand out against others. So they use different fabrics. They have different designs. They have different fits. They have all these different things that make their product slightly different from other people's. It's not identical, right? It's all clothing, but they make it different in some way. And so what we end up seeing, like there's lots of competition that goes on between these companies. And you probably see this within clothing companies, or restaurants is another good example where they, all make food, but they differentiate their food in some way. They can compete through the quality of their product, right? So, hey, we use a better fabric, we use better materials, like we have better fits, we have better designs. It could be through the price of the product. They compete by saying, hey, look at us. Like we have a lower price than our competitor, right? And that's why you should choose us. They use it through other marketing and advertising. So that's why you see, celebrities on, Instagram or Snapchat or whatever, like, advertising for certain products, because that's how they compete with one another, is by saying, hey, look, so-and-so uses our product, so-and-so endorses our product, and so you should use it too. Now, again, just like with perfect competition, we also see a monopolistic competition that firms will maximize their profit where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. That's true across the board. A few other characteristics we need to be aware of when it comes to monopolistic competition is, first of all, everyone has a small market share. So remember that, the pie that we showed earlier? Everyone has a really small slice of the pie. So same thing in clothing companies. Like everyone has a pretty small slice of the pie. So what one company does doesn't necessarily shift the entire market, because everyone represents such a small slice of the pie. We do see freedom of entry and exit. So new companies, new businesses, it's pretty easy for them to get involved in some way or become competitive within the market. There's not barriers that exist there. But also we see there's limited collusion because everyone has such a small slice. So collusion, again, is just a word that means like working together or coordinating together. And it's harder to do when there's so many companies trying to, to be a part of the market. Collusion doesn't really have any advantages for any of them. So we use the examples of restaurants. We use the example of clothing. Those are all great examples. But a lot of markets that you think of are monopolistically competitive, where there's lots of businesses selling similar but slightly different products. Now, this next one that's kind of like between lots and one is what we call an oligopoly. So an oligopoly is where we see a small number of firms existing within a market. So an oligopoly, again, we said few firms, they compete against each other by selling products that they might be identical or they might be fairly similar. Like there's not like a specific number necessarily within oligopoly. It all has to do with market power that they have within this structure. So it can be made up from anywhere just two companies. Like if we just have two companies, that can be like a duopoly, we call it. So like I think I've used the example in class of like batteries. Like there's Duracell and Energizer. Like those two have like a massive slice of the pie each. And their products are pretty well identical. Like, yeah, there's probably slight differences in their batteries, but for the most part, like they're the same product, But then we see other examples where there's a small number of firms producing similar but slightly different products. And I'll show a couple examples here in a minute. We say that there are legal or sometimes natural barriers that prevent firms from entering the market. So some of those legal barriers could be like certain protections on like certain products, right? Like who's able to make it or who has the technology to make those things. It can also be natural barriers. Like if I want to get in and start, into the battery business, like it's going to be pretty hard for me to compete with two companies that are already so established and have such a large slice of the pie. Now, a couple other characteristics or things that we see first and foremost is interdependence. So if we think about an oligopoly, with say Duracell and Energizer, right? Like the actions of one directly influence the actions and profits of the other. Like Duracell's always watching what Energizer's doing. Energizer's always watching what Duracell's doing. They are so dependent on one another and what the other is doing. They're paying close attention. Now, I'm not saying this happens within, within all markets, because the larger you get, like, yeah, they care, but maybe not as intensely. But the more concentrated the power is, you see more of that interdependence. But we also see a high concentration of the power. And what we mean by concentration is that there's only a small number of firms that have like almost complete control. And like I said, I'll show you a few examples here in a second that I think will make more sense to you. But because there are only a few firms, there are incentives for firms to collude or to work together. Now, again, collusion is illegal. It is not allowed. But sometimes they work together, maybe kind of even like behind the scenes or like implicitly, or what we call tacit collusion. It's like, hey, wink, wink, like we're raising our prices, maybe you should too, type thing. Now, again, just like perfect competition, just like monopolistic competition, firms will maximize their profit where? Or marginal cost equals marginal revenue. Again, just like you and I maximize our benefit where marginal cost is equal to marginal benefit, all firms will maximize their profit where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. We talked about a couple different examples that would fall under oligopolies. Like car companies is sometimes considered to be oligopolies. There's just a few major ones out there. Cell phone providers, Apple, Samsung, things like that. But I want to talk through a couple other examples that we can see that hopefully will demonstrate this idea a bit more. So looking at these examples, let's suppose down here we have a scale of the concentration, so meaning the percentage of the market that these companies own, right? So if we think of 100% being the entire pie, we're saying what size slice of the pie do these other companies have? So I think these numbers might be a year out of date, but they're still pretty accurate. If we think of the soft drink market, there's really three major companies there, and you guys are probably aware of these. The number one largest is Coca-Cola, right? Last I checked, they owned about 45% of the market. So that's a pretty big slice of the pie. Now, second to Coca-Cola would be Pepsi. I think that's pretty obvious. Last I checked, they had 25.9% of that pie. And then finally, there is a third. The third is Keurig Dr. Pepper. And they own another 21.1% of that drink market. But if we look at these and we add all three of these up, what we end up seeing is the three of these have 91.9% of the market. Right, so that's like a massive amount. That leaves less than 10% for those other smaller companies. And so when we talk about an oligopoly, we're saying that power is very concentrated at some of those higher ups. Another one that's kind of interesting is the credit card market. And so this isn't necessarily like, I'm not saying like Capital One or Chase or Fifth Third or whatever, but we're saying who are the ones extending that credit. So maybe you've heard of like Visa, right? Visa owns 54% of the market, meaning 54% of transactions done with credit cards are Visa credit cards, right? So that's a large amount. Another one you might guess that's up there is MasterCard. They have another 22.9%, and then American Express. So if you notice there, those three credit card companies, credit service providers, make up about 96% of that market. Right, so the top three there, when we talk about concentration, like right there, the top three own 96% of the market. And that is such a high concentration. And so we would definitely consider the credit card market to be an oligopoly. And then finally, one I think you guys are probably familiar with too is cell phone service market. So this isn't necessarily the phone providers. We're not saying Apple and Samsung here, but we're saying like, hey, in order for your phone to have service, who are you going to work through? And so last I checked, the largest was actually AT&T with about 42% of the market, right? So that's massive. That's a large slice. And then I think we can guess that Verizon has another pretty big chunk. And then after that recent merger between Sprint and T-Mobile owns another 27.4%. And so if you notice, those top three own 98.7% out of the 100%. So looking at these examples, like I just wanted to give you an idea of like, yeah, this is what an oligopoly is. Like an oligopoly is where we see massive market concentration at the top, right? And you can see that in all three of these markets. And you can probably think of some other markets where you can see that, hey, there's only a couple companies that really exist and have such big slices of that pie. Now from here, we're going to move from a few to just one. And so just one would be what we know as a monopoly, right? So looking at our scale here, we have monopoly as our last type of imperfect competition. So as you guys are probably aware, a monopoly is where we see just one firm with complete control over the market. One firm, complete control. Why do they have complete control? Well, because there's no close substitute. Maybe there's high barriers to entry, meaning it's a really difficult market to get into, and really only one can exist in there. Even though it's a monopoly, where do they maximize their profit? Well, they maximize their profit where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue, just like everything else, right? Monopolies can have complete control over the price within a market, and that's why, as we talked about last time with market failure, is that firms sometimes have restrictions in place in order to prevent this. Because think about it, consumers have no other option. Like, if that's my only choice, I got nowhere else to go. That's going to be who I might have to buy it from, right? And so we see sometimes there's barriers of entry, and those can be natural ones where it's, we'll talk about this later. We brought up like the idea of electric companies, right? It can be ownership. It can be maybe certain rights over certain resources or something. I know that's the case with some. Um, I think diamonds are kind of that way because like there's like certain diamond mines where the ownership over the mines exists within like a single entity or something like that. And then legal ones too, like patent protections, copyrights, things like that. Now there are types of monopolies that exist, and we'll run through each of these and why they exist and how they're allowed to exist. But the government does work to prevent those. We talked about that a little bit last time because of the way that monopolies are able to take advantage of the market. Now again, some do exist, like utilities is a good example, and you know the reasons for those. We'll talk about that in a second. But there are a few types of monopolies that do exist and are allowed to exist. So let's take a look at some of those. First and foremost, we might have something that's known as a natural monopoly. So a natural monopoly, this is one that you guys, we had brought up in class before, like an electric company. Like in Carmel, you got like one option for electric. It's Duke. Well, why? Why is that allowed to exist? Well, the reason is it's actually cheaper in order for one company to do it. It's a smaller cost than if multiple firms. Because like think if there was multiple electric companies competing, well, they would still all have to spread out an electric grid across the entire city. But now we're spreading out all those fixed costs of, you know, running electrical lines and stuff across the whole city. We're spreading it across a smaller number of customers. And so therefore everybody's paying a higher price as a result. And so it's actually cheaper for only one company to do it. Now, we had mentioned last time that, yes, the government will put restrictions in place in order to prevent abuses within some of those types of utilities or other markets where natural monopolies exist. But those are ones that are allowed to exist. A geographic monopoly is kind of one that just kind of exists sort of naturally as well. But like, for example, when I was in college, I used to have to drive through this really small town. I like to get to school, I had to drive some real back roads, and I would stop through this town that was over in western Indiana, and I knew this was like my last stop if I needed gas or if I wanted a drink for like another hour. Well, that was the only gas station in that small town, right? And it wasn't that they were driving out the competition or anything like that. It was just that, like, hey, they were the only one that like could exist and sustain business there. That was my only choice. And so they could charge whatever they wanted for gas there in that small town because it's like, listen, if I need gas right now, I got no other choices. And therefore, that'd be considered a geographic monopoly. It's a monopoly that exists due to the geography that's going on. We see technological monopolies exist. This happens with patents and copyrights. You know, if you like watch Shark Tank or something and they always ask like, hey, do you have a patent on this? It's because they want to make sure that that person has protection over their intellectual property. Maybe it's over the technology used to produce something or over the design of something. Because if you don't have that, like it starts moving toward those competitive markets where it's harder for you to recoup money from your research and development and things like that. And then finally, there are government monopolies that exist. I think an easy one to think about is like the USPS, like the people who deliver our mail. Like that is a government monopoly. Like they're the only ones who deliver mail. But it's again because there's some things that the government has deemed like, hey, it's more important for us to be able to do this and to be the ones who run this market. And finally, wrapping up with monopolies, just a couple things really quick. Preventing monopolies. We talked about this last time, but if you guys remember Sherman Antitrust from U.S. history in 1890, like they started looking around at like the John D. Rockefellers, U.S. Steel, Standard Oil, the Vanderbilts, Carnegies, all those guys. And they were like, hey, listen, we don't like what's going on. We need to start to limit the power or the ability to be able to create a monopoly or a cartel. So a cartel is when you see a small number of firms working together to essentially act as a monopoly. And they, we talk about those robber barons like I just brought up. But the problem with Sherman Antitrust, it was not very effective, mainly because it wasn't really enforced or that enforceable. And so later we saw the Clayton Antitrust law come along about 24 years later, where they tried to define what it meant to monopolize and restrict some of that more. And they also created the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, to be the ones to kind of oversee the monopoly power abuse and things like that. And so the FTC still exists to this day. They work to protect consumers, to prevent price fixing, prevent collusion, prevent mergers that we feel like might create a monopoly or produce too much market concentration as well. And then finally, just, they put different regulations in place. We mentioned this with some of those natural monopolies before, but just the idea that, like, hey, listen, if we're only going to have one electric company, we got to make sure that they're not abusing their power. So we're going to set limits or restrictions in place to keep that from happening. So that is 2.7. That is Unit 2 in a nutshell. Next time we get together, don't forget we're going to be going through kind of Unit 2 as a whole and just reviewing some of the big ideas and the key concepts. And then from there, we'll be moving into our Unit 2 test.